All right, guys. So Benjamin Netanyahu has put himself in an incredibly dire situation as hundreds of thousands of Israelis are currently taking to the streets to protest not his ongoing atrocities in Gaza or the West Bank, but his obstinance when it comes to getting a ceasefire deal that would include the return of Israeli hostages back to Israel. So here from Al Jazeera on some of the details of what's been happening over the last couple of days. They say that Israel is being rocked by mass protests as popular pressure mounts on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition cabinet to secure a ceasefire deal in Gaza that would see the 90 or so remaining captives thought to remain in Gaza brought home. They say hundreds of thousands of Israelis have packed the streets across the country in the largest demonstrations since the war on Gaza began, calling for the government to strike a deal. Now, we'll continue here, but I want you guys to keep in mind exactly the kind of position that Benjamin Netanyahu has put himself in. He understands that he's facing potential corruption charges in Israel. He understands that his governing coalition that's keeping him in power could fall apart the second that there's some sort of an end to the genocide, an end to the expansion of illegal settlements, etc., etc. He understands that the only thing that's keeping him in power is the current status quo continuing or escalating. And so that being the reality, it shouldn't be any surprise to anybody that he has been repeatedly sabotaging potential ceasefire deals over and over and over again for months at this point. And so that's why you have so many people showing up in the streets. They continue here. They say, what prompted these demonstrations? Grief and frustration. Many protesters suspect that Netanyahu and many of his cabinet members are deliberately stalling a deal. You don't say. Frustration over delays reached a tipping point on Saturday when Israeli forces operating in Gaza discovered the bodies of 6 captives. They say so far, Israel has killed more than 40,000 Palestinians and leveled much of Gaza during the 11 months of war. And that's a drastic underestimation, given what I've seen. They say in November of last year, negotiators succeeded in securing a temporary ceasefire for 7 days, giving hope to many of the families now demonstrating. That ceasefire back in November saw the release of 105 Israeli captives by Hamas in return for 210 Palestinian prisoners, mainly women and children, being held by Israeli forces. So 2 things here. Number 1, Israel is also holding hostages. Let's not forget that aspect of it, right? These are not like criminals who they've given their fair day in court and they've prosecuted them, and these are Hamas terrorists who participated in October 7th. No, Israel is holding thousands and thousands of Palestinians hostage. That's what they're doing. Many of these people have never been given a day in court. They're subjected to military court procedures. They are held without charge, without trial. They are essentially being kidnapped from either the West Bank or Gaza, right? And so back in November, you had an exchange. You had a temporary ceasefire deal that was put in place. And that was the bulk of the hostages that have been returned back to Israel. It hasn't come through military means, military operations, whatever you want to call it. It has come through a deal that was negotiated, right? And so if your main priority is returning hostages back to Israel, then you would go with that approach, not the Benjamin Netanyahu approach of trying to apply maximum military pressure. I mean, keep in mind, the 6 Israeli hostages who were recently found dead, where were they found dead? In Rafah. This was supposedly Biden's red line a few months ago. Remember when Biden pretended to have a red line when it came to the IDF invading and occupying Rafah? What happened to that? Now you have 6 dead Israeli hostages on top of the other hostages that we've talked about previously, many of whom have been killed directly by the IDF's operations in Gaza. The only thing that is going to come from Benjamin Netanyahu refusing a ceasefire deal and continuing with this genocide is you're going to have more dead Palestinians and also more dead Israelis at the same time. And so I understand why some of these people are protesting, because it's incredibly obvious at this point. Who's standing in the way of a ceasefire deal? It's not Hamas, right? It's not even necessarily the United States, even though we've been enabling that, and we'll get to more reporting on that here in a second, but it's Benjamin Netanyahu and his governing coalition, who again understands that they cannot keep themselves intact if there was a ceasefire deal that was put in place. So essentially you have a situation where Benjamin Netanyahu is willing to sacrifice or even kill, in some circumstances, the Israeli hostages in an effort to keep this going, the current status quo, or to potentially escalate it even further. And so now we get to reports here from Jeremy Scahill of Dropsite News. How the U.S. enabled Netanyahu to sabotage a ceasefire deal. They say after the bodies of 6 more Israeli hostages of Hamas were found in the Gaza Strip, pressure in Israel is mounting on the government to secure a ceasefire deal and free the remaining hostages and soldiers taken captive on October 7th. The announcement on Sunday that the captives, including a dual U.S. citizen, were discovered in a tunnel in Rafah has further fueled the rage against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, particularly from families of those who are currently held in Gaza. They have accused the Prime Minister of sabotaging deals to free their loved ones, saying their blood is on his hands. And it's hard to disagree with them, right? They say senior Israeli officials, most prominently the defense minister Yoav Gallant, have joined the public demands for Netanyahu to stop obstructing ceasefire negotiations. So even the Israeli defense minister, okay, who's not some dove, right? Even he is recognizing, oh, Benjamin Netanyahu is not serious about getting a ceasefire deal. In fact, he's sabotaging it. But they continue. They say, while Hamas has said that they will not participate in any process until the U.S. convinces Israel to accept a negotiating framework that Hamas agreed to in early July. If you guys remember at the time, this is what the Biden administration was saying was Israel's deal. So Hamas is now saying Israel should accept what Israel's own deal was. But of course, they keep changing it over and over and over again. The parameters of the deal, the details of the deal, because they don't actually want one, right? They say both Hamas and the families of Israeli captives still held in Gaza have stated that Netanyahu bears responsibility for continuing the war and preventing the exchange of prisoners. They say the White House clearly hopes that the events of the past 24 hours alter the current course. After being briefed on Saturday on the hostages found in Rafah, Joe Biden, who is vacationing in Delaware, in Rehoboth. By the way, I happen to be going to Rehoboth this weekend, so maybe I'll see Joe Biden there. Maybe we can ask him about this. But Joe Biden said, I think we're on the verge of having an agreement, adding, we think we can close the deal. They've all said that they agree on the principles. How many times have you heard this kind of a thing from Joe Biden? How many times have you heard, well, Israel has agreed, it's just on Hamas to accept the parameters of the deal? We've heard this time and time and time again, probably dozens of times at this point. And so Biden is vacationing in Delaware, and he's saying, well, we hope that something's on the table and maybe we'll be able to close a deal. Okay, do we believe that? They continue. They say, following a meeting on Sunday with an association of family members of Israeli captives, the head of the Histadrut, probably butchering that name, but the Histadrut Labor Federation, a union essentially, is in fact Israel's largest trade union, announced a general strike. And if that action extends beyond a symbolic strike for 1 or 2 days, which looking back on it seems like that's kind of what happened, but it could cascade into a formidable crisis for Netanyahu. They say Netanyahu abandoned the hostages. This is now a fact, the family association said in a statement. We call on the public to prepare. We will bring the country to a halt. The abandonment is over. And I mean, keep in mind, I've covered the reporting before on how Israel's economy is already in crisis for a number of different reasons, both because of, global isolation, because of their ongoing genocidal actions against the Palestinians in Gaza, but also because of stalling tourism and also because of small businesses being forced to shut down and the shipping lanes being disrupted, and also their refusal to allow Palestinians to come into Israel who used to work for Israeli companies. There are a bunch of different factors that are at play here, but the Israeli economy is on the verge of just completely collapsing at this point, along with the Benjamin Netanyahu governing coalition. But they continue. They say Vice President Kamala Harris, and I covered this recently, but let's remind ourselves here, released a statement after these hostages were found, endorsing Israel's version of events on the captives found in Rafah, and echoed Netanyahu's pledge to eliminate Hamas. This is what she said. Hamas is an evil terrorist organization. With these murders, Hamas has even more American blood on its hands, she said, referring to the death of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, a dual citizen whose parents spoke at the DNC in Chicago earlier this month. They say that Polin was abducted from the Nova Music Festival on October 7th and lost part of his arm after a grenade exploded in a shelter that he was hiding in. She also said the threat that Hamas poses to the people of Israel and American citizens in Israel must be eliminated, and Hamas cannot control Gaza. So I want to focus on this last part here, right? Now, I don't want to just skip over. Obviously, it's tragic that somebody lost their arm and whatever the case may be, somebody was taken hostage. Taking civilians as hostages is obviously a war crime, whether it's Israel or Hamas that's doing it. But let's focus on this last part here. Hamas must be eliminated and cannot control Gaza. Guys, this is not something that even US officials believe is possible. The elimination of Hamas is not on the table. We are 11 months in to a genocide where Israel has targeted mosques and schools and churches and refugee camps and UN shelters and aid workers and journalists, everything. So the idea that you're even remotely close to eliminating Hamas, no, you're not. You're not. We've seen the statistics in terms of how many Hamas battalions, how many different forces have been taken out. You are nowhere close, not to mention the fact that this ongoing genocide is obviously going to radicalize some people into potentially fighting back against the IDF 11 months into this. So the idea that eliminating Hamas and completely removing them from power, that's on the table or that's in the immediate future, it's just not. It's just not. And again, this is even to the right of some top Israeli military officials. US officials, many Israeli officials don't believe that this is something that can happen. And yet you have Kamala Harris coming out and endorsing the Benjamin Netanyahu strategy, keeping in mind that Benjamin Netanyahu wants Trump to win this election. I mean, how pathetic is that? We knew this before when Biden was still the candidate, and we knew that this was going to be the case when Kamala was the candidate. This guy does not even want you to win the presidential election. And I would not be surprised if Bibi was willing to even escalate this war regionally to something broader in order to try to get Trump elected in November. Wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if that's what ends up happening. And you are still bending over for him as an individual, not for the Israeli people, not for the Israeli hostages, not for the Palestinian people, but for Benjamin Netanyahu. You are willing to bend over and to go fully with his narrative on this, something that is completely unattainable. And your own officials know that this is unattainable. Israeli officials know that this is unattainable, but you're still going along with this messaging. This kind of messaging is what's going to get more Israeli hostages killed. It's what's going to continue with the genocide and get more Palestinian civilians, women, children, the elderly, the sick, the vulnerable, killed. That's what this strategy is going to do. And yet this is the messaging that Kamala Harris is going along with. I mean, it's just fucking pathetic, man. It's just pathetic. And keep in mind, when she points out American blood is on their hands, okay, fine, sure, you can criticize Hamas, that's great. What about Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian American citizen who was sniped? She was assassinated by Israeli snipers in Jenin, one of the places where Israel is heavily focusing their current West Bank invasion on, where they're also targeting journalists right now as we speak. What about Shireen Abu Akleh? What about the spilling of that Palestinian American's blood? Nothing. No consequences on that. But when it comes to Hamas doing it, then now suddenly it's a huge deal. But when it's Israel doing it, then nobody gives a fuck. How many Palestinian Americans have been killed as a part of this genocide? I mean, it's complete insanity, right? Now, I highly recommend you guys go and read this entire article. I'll link it down below. One more paragraph that I wanted to read here. Netanyahu's coup against his own ceasefire proposal. Since early July, Netanyahu has intensified Israel's attacks in Gaza, repeatedly added new terms to the framework, and assassinated Ismail Haniyeh, who was Hamas's political leader and its lead negotiator in Tehran, in Iran, right? And among new demands put forward by the Netanyahu government is the right to continue occupying the Philadelphia corridor along the border with Egypt, to maintain control of the Rafah border crossing, and to position Israeli troops in central Gaza along the Netzarim axis, where IDF forces would establish checkpoints to search Palestinians seeking to return to their homes in northern Gaza. So you guys understand the strategy here, right? The second that we get closer and closer towards a potential ceasefire deal, Netanyahu will, number one, commit some massive massacre inside of Gaza to try to sabotage the deals, or he'll just completely change the framework of the deal. In this case, we're talking about one of Israel's main demands is to continue with the occupation of Gaza, to continue to have the right to resume the war whenever they want. That's not a permanent ceasefire deal. That's not what that is. By the way, Egypt also has an issue with Israel occupying the Philadelphia corridor because that's right on their fucking border. That's against previous agreements that were signed under the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. And Israel's one of their main sticking points that they've now come up with is, well, we want to maintain an occupation of the Philadelphia corridor on the southern border of Gaza, and also the Netzarim corridor, or the axis towards the middle of Gaza. So effectively, Israel's main demand, their sticking point right now, seems to be that in order to get a ceasefire deal put in place, we want it to not be a ceasefire. We want to continue to reserve the right to resume the war whenever, however we want, and we also want to continue to occupy Gaza indefinitely. That's the main demand. Does that seem like a permanent ceasefire deal? Does that seem like a reasonable request that Hamas would ever in a fucking million years agree to? Of course not. And Hamas, by the way, even backed off of some of their requests in terms of the timetable of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. They backed off of many of those requests. They gave into many of the Israeli demands that I never thought that Hamas would ever give into. And they still gave into that, and now Benjamin Netanyahu comes along and he adds new requests on top of the previous ones, in what I think is an obvious effort to try to make sure that this kind of a deal never happens. We also had to back up that same point, hear from Prem Thacker, talking about some reporting here from Haaretz, obviously an Israeli outlet. They say Benjamin Netanyahu decided some weeks ago that he does not want a deal. I think it was actually months ago, but they say weeks ago. And when it became possible, he got nervous and did all that he could to torpedo it. He figured out that by using the Philadelphia corridor, he could also draw the sane right to his side and win some points with this group. The media fell for this spin and is consumed all day long with the question of yes or no to the Philadelphia corridor, when the real question is really the fate of the hostages versus the fate of the coalition. And that's exactly right. I mean, here we have, Israeli officials who are admitting he just brought up this point to sabotage the deal, right? He made this his main sticking point. We also have a clip here. Now, this clip is from a recent press conference that Benjamin Netanyahu gave, I think in an effort, obviously, to sabotage any sort of a ceasefire deal. And what you'll notice in this video is that Benjamin Netanyahu is relying on Joe Biden's undying support for whatever he personally wants in order to make the argument in favor of his case, right? Let's go ahead and watch this. I want you guys to notice how many U.S. officials does Benjamin Netanyahu cite in his speech here. He is using the Biden administration as cover to get against a ceasefire proposal, to make an argument against a ceasefire proposal. Think about that. These are the same people, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, who have been repeatedly saying we're working tirelessly for a ceasefire. Here's Benjamin Netanyahu.
I was asked whether I'm not doing enough to the release of hostages. Well, I want to set the record straight. On April 27th, Secretary of State Blinken said that Israel made an extraordinarily generous offer for a hostage deal. On May 31st, Israel agreed to a U.S.-backed proposal. Hamas refused. On August 16th, Israel agreed to what the United States defined as a final bridging proposal. Hamas refused again. On August 19th, Secretary Blinken said, Israel accepted the U.S. proposal. Now Hamas must do the same. On August 28th, that's 5 days ago, Deputy CIA Director said that Israel shows seriousness in the negotiations. Now Hamas must show the same seriousness. I want to ask you something. What has changed in the last 5 days? What has changed? One thing. These murderers executed 6 of our hostages. They shot them in the back of the head. That's what's changed. And now after this, we're asked to show seriousness? We're asked to make concessions? What message does this send Hamas? It says, kill more hostages, murder more hostages, you'll get more concessions. The pressure internationally must be directed at these killers.
So again, notice how here you have the Prime Minister of Israel citing U.S. officials, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the CIA Director, Joe Biden. He is citing them to make an anti-ceasefire argument here. That's what he's doing. So keep that in mind whenever you hear Kamala Harris, Joe Biden make the claim that we're working tirelessly for a ceasefire. Number one, if you actually wanted a ceasefire, you would cease the firing. Step number one, you would stop sending Israel weapons, right? Which is, as a reminder, against international law and also against U.S. domestic law, right? you would stop sending them the weapons to continue with the genocide. That would be step number one if you were tirelessly working for a ceasefire. But step number two would be stop giving Benjamin Netanyahu cover to make these kinds of arguments. I mean, again, even the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, in Israel, even he is saying Benjamin Netanyahu is being obstinate. He is the main obstacle to getting a ceasefire deal. And here he is citing U.S. officials to make his case. I mean, it's fucking pathetic, right? Now, we also had as part of the same press conference that he was giving here, look at this map here. Bibi, yet again. Now, keep in mind, he did this, I think it was like a month or so before October 7th. He went to the United Nations. He put up a map of Israel and the surrounding region. And on that map, he effectively erased Gaza and the West Bank. In effect, asserting that this was Israeli-controlled territory, which it is. Logistically, it is under Israeli occupation. But look at this map here, guys. Here we have Benjamin Netanyahu talking about the situation in Gaza. And if you notice something here, it seems like there's a little bit of something missing over here in this area, right? Here we have Benjamin Netanyahu completely erasing the West Bank from existence. On this map, the West Bank is part of Israel. Now, again, in effect, the West Bank is under Israeli occupation. It is under an ongoing Israeli invasion, right? So, in effect, it is under the control of Israel, sure. But this is internationally recognized for decades at this point. Palestinian land. This is land that has been occupied illegally under international law by Israel since 1967. And here he is getting up proudly on television and erasing the West Bank from existence. And this is not some hypothetical thing. This is not a whoopsie daisy. It's not an accident. This is part of his ongoing policy of expanding illegal settlements in the West Bank. They want to annex the West Bank, what they call Judea and Samaria, right? And this is just yet another example of that. I mean, this should be an outrage to anybody, especially coming from the United States, the same people who look at Russia invading Ukraine and say, isn't Putin such a war criminal, right? I thought we were against the taking of land by force through military means. When it's Russia doing that to Ukraine, the US and the West broadly has no issue calling that out as imperialism, right? As a series of war crimes or even a genocide, according to many Western leaders. But when it comes to one of our allies in Israel doing the same thing decade after decade after decade to Palestinians, suddenly it's not a big deal. In fact, we had Matthew Miller, one of the worst, most egregious State Department ghouls, who was asked about this, right? One of these journalists, Nadia, she said, yesterday Netanyahu showed a map with no West Bank. Is this normal? Miller said, I'm not going to comment. And she responded by saying, I'm just saying, is that normal for you? He said again, I'm not going to comment. He has nothing to say about this. But believe me, the Biden administration has a lot to say when some kid on a college campus says from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They have something to say about that. But then when it's Benjamin Netanyahu erasing the West Bank from existence and continuing with actual physical policies in reality to annex the West Bank, and when he talks about from the river to the sea, there will be nothing but Israeli sovereignty, then suddenly we have nothing to say about it. No comment. No comment. Really, no comment. But Hamas is a genocidal terrorist organization. What is that? Now, we also have, again, as Israel is continuing with their West Bank invasion, this great reporting here. I won't get into it to make this video not an hour long, but again, highly recommend you guys go and read this because we have some direct testimony from people on the ground in the West Bank here, reported from Dropsite News, who give a perspective on some of the attacks on the hospitals and the other civilian infrastructure inside of the West Bank. Now, again, this is the largest invasion of the West Bank for decades. For decades. Here's the headline. Israel surrounds Jenin hospitals, restricting access to power and water. Some of the basic statistics on this. Over the past week, armored Israeli bulldozers have torn through Jenin. And by the way, Jenin is the same place that Shireen Abu Akleh was assassinated by the IDF, by the Israeli security forces. So as these Israeli armored bulldozers have torn through Jenin over the past week, ripping up roads, tearing down shops and markets, and destroying critical infrastructure, according to the Jenin municipality, more than 70% of Jenin's streets have been bulldozed. Does anybody even bother coming up with some sort of a justification for this anymore? They've destroyed 70% of the streets with bulldozers. Is that a military operation? I mean, is there a Hamas militant hiding directly underneath the asphalt? Is that at this point, nobody even bothers to come up with some sort of an explanation. You're destroying a majority of these streets in this entire area in Jenin. They continue, 20 kilometers of water and sewage networks have been destroyed. Communication and electric cables have been destroyed. Water has been cut off from 80% of the city, including the entire refugee camp where a curfew has been imposed, preventing most residents from entering or leaving. So 70% of the streets, 20 kilometers of water and sewage networks, 80% of the water has been cut off. Communication and electricity has been destroyed. I mean, this is exactly what they did in Gaza. So here we have the genocide in Gaza expanding to the West Bank. It's hard to look at this in any other way. And I'll show you guys the videos here. I got a couple of videos lined up here in just a minute. But we also have, of course, as this is all happening, as pointed out here by Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch, settlers are rapidly seizing West Bank land beyond Israel's authorized, still illegal settlements. There are currently at least 196 unauthorized outposts across the West Bank, and 29 were set up last year, which is more than any previous year. So in other words, Israel is using the ongoing genocide in Gaza as a distraction to rapidly ramp up their ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. That's what's happening here. And some of the videos, I mean, this is just one example. Guys, I have seen probably half a dozen videos of Israeli bulldozers directly trying to plow into Palestinian journalists in the West Bank. This is just one example. Let's watch this. I mean, here you have, what seems like a dozen or so bulldozers that are going through the West Bank. Here you have the first one that seems to try to run into this guy. He's backing up. Then you have a second one that comes by here in a second that also tries to run into him. I mean, this is a journalist here, guys. Here you have, look, he has a step aside again. This guy's not following a natural path driving this bulldozer. I mean, 2 separate times just in that one video, we had Israeli bulldozers that were trying to run over a journalist. First off, why do you have bulldozers in the West Bank? Why do you have bulldozers in the West Bank? We also have, here's another example, right? Put this on low volume here. An Israeli bulldozer just destroying a shop front. Do you guys believe that there is some sort of a militant inside this shop? Is that why they're doing this? Look at the destruction around here. Imagine that this was the street that you lived on. Imagine you lived in this apartment here, guys. I mean, seriously. Destroying the entirety of the shop front. Why? Because they fucking can. Here we have again. Digging up the roads. They have specialized vehicles that are designed to put massive rifts in the roads. This is how you end up 70% of the roads destroyed. Now, I'll finish off with this. Guys, listen. If I was in this kind of a situation, imagine yourself in this kind of a situation. You are under decades of illegal occupation from a foreign occupying power, right? Backed up by the largest military, the largest economy in the world, the United States of America. If I was faced with decades of this, if my family was being subjected to potential arbitrary arrest, torture, violence, killing, whatever the case may be, going out in front of my home, destroying the roads for the sake of it, making it so that I don't have access to electricity or water or other basic human necessities, what would you do in this situation? What would you do? I mean, the reason I bring that up is because the whole justification from Israel on this is, well, there are Palestinian militants in this area. Yeah, there are. In Jenin, in the West Bank, that's a stronghold for Palestinian resistance forces. Ask yourselves, why do those resistance forces exist in the first place?
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying